Hello, it's Pinecone and Pulumi, and we are taking off so you can launch your next serverless vector database index with Pulumi infrastructure as code, written in the language of your choice, including Python, TypeScript, Golang, YAML, and more. In the burgeoning AI landscape, Pinecone's vector database is designed from the ground up to be the most performant cloud-native index on the market. Hello, I'm Kat Morgan. I'm a community engineer on the Pulumi developer relations team here to show you the ropes with the newest provider in the registry. So why does infrastructure as code, or IAC, matter for your next AI application? Code powers the digital landscape of today, and with Pulumi, your favorite language will orchestrate your cloud services as declarative infrastructure configuration code. Why are we talking about Pinecone though? Well, modern AI applications powered by large language models, or LLMs, and retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, are themselves proving themselves with broad value across many industries. But these tools are only as good as they are accurate. AI apps powered by conventional LLMs are probability engines. This means you can prompt an AI application with the same prompt more than once, and in return receive slightly different responses each time. Of course, this is not an acceptable caveat for applications which depend on exact data or relevant and related content. Your vector database is the solution to powering many of these types of needs, and we can dive in right away with Pinecone today. So let's get to it. First, let's go find our Pinecone Pulumi integration. Let's go ahead and run with Pinecone integrations. Takes us straight to the Pinecone page, and here we can go ahead and search for Pulumi. That brings us to our Pulumi registry, but I also want to show you how to find packages with Pulumi as well. So let's jump to our Pulumi registry. This is where we maintain a centralized hub of all of the different Pulumi integrations as well. We can filter down to Pinecone. And of course, right here, we have an example of how to go ahead and code up a Pinecone index with Pulumi IAC. But let's go ahead and dive into deploying this for real. Now that we know where to find our provider documentation, let's see if we can build a Pulumi IAC project to deploy a new Pinecone index from scratch. We're going to create a new repo with the GitHub CLI. Of course, you can do this same task in the web UI and then clone that down. But I'm also going to be using the Pulumi dev container as a template repository so that I already have my preferred developer environment ready to go. With our repository created, let's actually go ahead and use our dev container in GitHub code spaces. Now, if you use the VS Code, you can use the dev container locally with VS Code and Docker Desktop, or you can use your GitHub account and just launch the dev container. And then you connect to it in the browser or with your VS Code develop IDE directly. All right, so we just opened up the Codespaces web UI to launch the code spaces of our choice. There are several different dev containers to choose from. We're going to actually just go with the Pulumi dev container extra. That includes a whole bunch of extra things, including Docker CLI, so that we can build container images and push to the cloud. We're not going to use that today, but if we did, we'd probably come in here and choose a larger virtual machine size. So let's go ahead and, for expedience sake, pick a 4-core. We're going to create the code spaces. And that's going to build real fast. And by real fast, this is probably a good time to grab a coffee, take a bio break, maybe get a snack. I'll be back at this screen in just a couple minutes, and everything will be ready to go. All right, check it out. Our Pulumi dev container is completely ready to use. We have a clean and fresh Git repository here, so we're just going to go ahead and start with a Pulumi login. All right, so we've pasted our Pulumi API key. Now, there is a link below if you need to grab an API key to log in yourself. All right, now let's go ahead and take a look at what's already here. So there are several different artifacts which may or may not be useful depending on what kind of a project you're starting. So if you use a dev container, feel free to eliminate any of the starter templates that you don't need. We're going to jump into the CLI real quick, and we're going to run a Pulumi new command. So the Pulumi new is how you consume different templates that are kind of pre-baked for you to use in your own projects. And we'll use that as a basis for starting our Pinecone project. So I have a command ready on my clipboard. You can see I'm using a few different flags here. First off, the arguments are Pulumi new and the name of the template that we're actually going to use. So Pinecone TypeScript is one of the templates that we have ready for you to try. We're going to use stack name, which is dev. So in the world of Pulumi and infrastructure as code, you can take the same IAC and deploy it to multiple different targets, whether that's dev, staging, prod, or if you have US West and US East or different regions all around the globe. I am using a force flag, and that's just so that it accepts the fact that there's already some other files in the directory. Now we can see that it created the new project, it created the stack named dev, and it's installing several different NPM packages to make sure that it has the baseline Pulumi packages required to run a program. So from here, we could actually test Pulumi up by using the Pulumi preview command. And it's going to go take a look and see if it can actually provision the infrastructure that it needs. We're going to select the stack dev that we just created. If you're ever curious which stack you're on, Pulumi stack ls. Right now, we just have one for this project. I'm going to go ahead and export my Pinecone API token. So right now, the Pulumi program is in this index.ts. You can see the template is very basic right now. And by default, the Pinecone provider will look for this Pinecone API key environment variable. We'll get to another way of configuring secrets and passing those into your program in just a minute, but let's go ahead and see if our program will work. All right, so I have this command Pulumi up. And this is just going to include a couple flags for yes, that I do in fact want to deploy. That's a little bit of a YOLO technique, so don't practice that in prod, but it's really helpful when you're already in a developer workflow and you just need to continue doing a Pulumi up repetitively while you're developing your infrastructure stack. Skip preview just allows us to go straight to deploying. We already ran the preview command, so we saw a graph of what resources it's going to try and provision. We can safely go ahead and Pulumi up with skip preview. Now, as it is creating, you can see that it produces output, which informs you what resources it's working on at any given time. This is an extremely simple IAC program, so we don't have to worry too much about that taking forever, but let's actually log into Pinecone and see if we can find our resources. All right, I'm going to log in just real quick. There we go. This is our Pinecone index. Now, I didn't show you this page before we started our deployment, so let's come back here and try pulling me down. Now, basically what this is going to do is it's just going to come in here and it's going to tear down all of the resources that it created before. So if we come back to our Pinecone console, we should be able to refresh the page, and there it is. Our index is gone. So we can confirm that Pulumi is controlling our Pinecone index resources. I mentioned just a minute ago that we could actually teach Pulumi to pick up the secret Pinecone API key from another resource. Let's take a look and see how we can pass that into our code base. Now, the first thing we're going to do is enable Copilot. We could always code without it, but for fun, why not just to see how far this gets us? All right, so we're going to create a Pulumi config here. We're writing in TypeScript, so we're going to start that line with a constant, just defining a config out of the Pulumi config object from the Pulumi package itself. Now we're gonna actually set a Pinecone from config. So let's see if it has a good recommendation on here. Ultimately, we do need to set config require secret. Now you can do this a couple different ways. You can do get, which is useful if you're just getting a value from config, but because this is secret, we want to do config secret so that we're protecting that secret. Sorry, I'm using my Python chops over here and it's messing me up. But look, config.get secret is recommending a good auto completion here. But instead of get, we actually want to do a require secret. And this means that the infrastructure as code program will not proceed unless the secret is provided. And since we know we need an API key to provision our Pulumi IAC, we're just not going to allow the program to run without that API key. Now, finally, we need to create a Pinecone provider which injects the API key into the various API calls that Pulumi is going to make against Pinecone. So let's go ahead and give that a try. Now it looks like this is pretty close to accurate, but Copilot is recommending a camel case that is not actually accurate to the provider we're using. So that is actually going to get us where we need to go. If you wanted to look at it just real quick, let's jump to our Pinecone package again. If we click on this provider, we can see that our options are API key. And so that way, if we jump to TypeScript, we can see our input is that API key and how it is actually camel cased. So jumping back to our IDE, now that we have this provider, all we have to do is actually integrate it into our new Pinecone index resource. We're not going to be changing anything in the spec of the resource itself. We're only going to be changing how we pass the provider with authentication details. No, let's actually, okay. So now we should be good to go ahead and continue. And let's see if we can deploy without our Pinecone API environment variable. All right, so there's no Pinecone environment variable left in our shell. We should be good to see the program fail. So let's try a fail mode first with this require secret. And there we go. Now you have your diagnostic, which informs you you need to set an API key before you can continue. So we're going to do Pulumi config set. There is a secret here. The secret flag just informs Pulumi to salt and encrypt this Pinecone API key and not let that be readable in plain text. And of course, we're going to be reading it off of our provider is pulling it out of API key, lowercase API, uppercase K. Okay, so now we have our prompt to drop the key. We'll paste that in there and try Pulumi up again. There we go. Now we have our provider resource, which is recorded in Pulumi. We have our Pinecone index. We have an address for our index. If you're using this in production, and you wanted to write several other IAC stacks and consume this output, this is an output you can actually feed into other Pulumi IAC so that you can take this address and just consume it in several other locations. Or you can create a larger mono repo to include several different AWS or Azure or other cloud resources to fully configure a app delivery architecture. Let's double check our Pinecone console, and sure enough, it's an index. So with that, we're going to go ahead and Pulumi destroy to tear it all down, because I'm going to clean up the resources that we just created. We don't need to be billed for anything that we're not using right away, and that's all it takes. I hope you enjoyed building a Pinecone index with Pulumi. I cannot wait to see what you build next with this new provider, and of course, it's time for me to say sign off. So as always, go build stuff, go break stuff, and do it all with Pulumi.